For those of you that don't know, this is part of the Centre for Global Development Summer School, and this is the final session with Hilary Benn today, and we wanted to open it up to try and get a wide audience, so that's very pleasing. But the Centre for Global Development, for those of you that do work in the university and are interested in international development and don't know what it is, Egla here at the front controls the lists, and basically if you're interested in anything related to development, if you get on that list, then we circulate information about seminars, networking events and so on. So we're welcome to have a wider membership than we've already got, which is already relatively active and going really well in the last year. So given the shortage of time, I'm not going to spend too much time introducing Hilary Benn, but we're really pleased to have him. Obviously he's got a long history working on issues of international development and both at different levels of government, and he's also got quite a long history of working with the University of Leeds and has been here on several occasions to talk, so we're really pleased to have him here again today. So I'd like to take you
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation, and thanks all of you for coming, particularly on such a nice and glorious day, because this could just be the summer, given how grotty and awful it's been. The worst part about accepting a wonderful invitation like this is being pressed by email to come up with a title. And I'm now reflecting on why exactly I chose the title that I did, and it may not bear a lot of relationship to what it is I have to say, and I shall speak for a bit and then we can get into a discussion, debate and argument, because I hope you all, I'm not naturally argumentative, but you know what I mean. We can discuss what is going on in the world, because there are two competing trends. One is we look at the big issues that we face and we realise that we need to cooperate together globally in order to deal with them. We're now 7 billion human beings on this small and fragile planet, could be heading towards 10 billion. The biggest issue of all, the change to the climate, self-evidently, national governments can't deal with this, but trying to sort it out is proving to be quite hard. And Margot, who came in particular to lobby me on this on a number of occasions in the past, and I, for my sins, led the UK delegation at the Bali negotiations in 2007, when in effect we were trying to open the door to a new climate change treaty. And the truth is very simply this: every country in the world, from the most impoverished to the most wealthy, each of them worries about the impact of doing something about climate change on their own economic development. Exactly the same concerns, but from completely different perspectives. Secondly, a perfectly powerful argument made by most vocally countries like China and India, who would say to the developed, in inverted commas, world, well look, you've had all the benefit of carbon development, mate, and now you're coming to tell us that you're really sorry, we've run out of our capacity to emit carbon, so we can't have what you've had. No, you need to go and sort yourselves out first. And then within that, because we had an architecture that was created, the Annex 1 and the non-Annex 1 countries, the rich, inverted commas, developed countries who had particular responsibilities and the rest of whom other things were asked, because the world is changing, the developing countries as a group covered everybody. And what was striking in those negotiations and subsequently was some of the other countries looking at China and India and saying, well now hang on a minute, you can't really say that the obligations that should be placed upon us, say Mali or Burkina Faso, you can't say that there should be the same obligations on those two countries as there should be on China and India. And then the very smallest island states would say, you know what, all of you, while you are arguing and failing to reach an agreement about what we're going to do about this great global threat, we're the first ones who are going to disappear under the water. So we're going to be drowning while you're still debating. And it is true because obviously China industrializing at an astonishing rate, a process of development that has reduced absolute poverty in that country. Well, I think Vietnam, it's been a while since I looked in detail at the statistics, but I think Vietnam holds the record for the fastest progression out of poverty for the bigger proportion of its citizens of any country in human history, which shows what is possible. but it brings its own challenges, not least because of development based on carbon emissions. And so the Chinese and the Indians had a perfectly good argument, but the counter-argument was very simply this. Okay, we wake up tomorrow morning and the OECD countries, Europe, America, New Zealand, we've suddenly discovered how to carry on without emitting any more carbon from tomorrow morning. We've solved it as far as we're concerned. Problem, we still have a challenge of climate change because of the emissions that are already out there and the rising emissions from countries like China, India and others as they develop. And that is why everybody has to put something on the table. And tackling climate change in the end is about going around the room and saying, okay, what are you prepared to offer? And that's why getting agreement in Europe was so important, because Europe was able to bring something to the table. That's why the Climate Change Act, which we passed in Britain, the first in the world, was so significant, because you have to demonstrate what you're prepared to do at home to then have actually credibility and to show that you are playing your part in making a contribution. And you could, in the end, you could go around the table and someone would add up and say, right, okay, we're heading for 450 parts per million, we're heading for an average temperature increase of 2 to 3 degrees. Everybody happy with that? Any objections? And if we're short, we need to go round and try again. The second example I would give is conflict, because, as you know better than anybody else, war and civil war and conflict is pretty darn incompatible with tackling poverty and a country growing and developing. And I would spend, when I was the International Development Secretary, quite a lot of my time, I think I devoted most of my time to Darfur in Sudan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Afghanistan for slightly different reasons, countries which, Sierra Leone, the aftermath of the terrible civil war there, countries, and two of those, when I was doing the job, had the unique distinction of being the two countries with the highest rates of infant mortality in the world. Of course, in part because of the conflict that they had experienced. And it is, peace and stability is the building block of development. It's true here in Leeds. If you've got communities where there's crime and antisocial behaviour and so on, people aren't terribly keen to live there. That's why perfectly good houses in Halton Moor, which I used to represent until the boundaries changed, perfectly good houses in terms of bricks and mortar and roofs were being knocked down at the time I was elected 14 years ago. Not because there was anything wrong with the bricks and mortar, but they were in communities where people said, oh, I don't want to go live there. And why was that? Because of the quality of life in the area. Now that's a smaller example of the point that I'm trying to make. And therefore tackling that is fundamental to progress. And I would say that as far as the global community is concerned, look at what is happening in Syria at the moment. Look at what's happening in Cairo and Egypt as we speak. We are in the process of trying to work out as a world, what do we do about nations which are in conflict, where states either are incapable of protecting their citizens or are inflicting violence on their citizens. What do we do about conflicts between states? And I would draw the analogy with the way in which our attitude to domestic violence in our society has changed over 40 years. 40 years ago, someone would ring the police and say, this bloke's beating up his wife, and the police would tend to say, well, you know, that's a domestic incident, it's not really for us to get involved in this. Why? Because we regarded the home sphere, family relationships as being a kind of matter for the parties and not a matter for society. In exactly the same way as people would have said, yeah, I know there's a civil war going on in that country, but you know what? It's an internal matter. And we, in international law, had established over time, you know, the sanctity of the nation state. Question, is that good enough? I would answer, no, it isn't. And society now says, a recent example being the photograph of, that we saw in the newspapers, of two rather well-known people having a meal outside, which was then posted, and one of them accepted a caution, to take a modern example. Society's attitude to violence between individuals or conflict has changed, and we say, you know what, it is our business. And we, in my view, are in the middle of trying to work out how we're going to make that happen in the world of which we are part. And it's difficult because the UN Security Council, which is the place that should be sanctioning action of that sort, sometimes cannot reach agreement, and we've seen that because of the use of the veto or threatened use of the veto. That's the first question. The second question is, if we agree to take certain action, who's going to do the work? We lack capacity in the global system. One of the reasons I, as the International Development Secretary, supported the AU force in Darfur with development money, because we bought vehicles, we bought fuel contracts, because we were spending a lot of money, us and the Americans more than anybody else, keeping people alive in the camps in Darfur, but there was a lack of security, both within the camps and crucially outside the camps, women going out to collect firewood, being attacked and raped, and therefore building the African Union's capacity to support people in these circumstances. I saw that as being a part of our work to encourage peace, stability and development in other countries around the world. But it's work in progress. And then the third question is, in asking who's going to do the work, for certain types of activities, the world tends to look to a very small number of countries that seem to have the capacity. I'm very strongly in favour of building the capacity across the piece. Because you've got conflict in Africa, you know what, the AU should be taking the lead. It should, because it's in its own backyard. And I do support the right to protect, but we haven't yet found a way of making it work. It is hotly contested and debated, and people are accused of hypocrisy and inconsistency. I would only observe on that charge, just because you can't do the right thing everywhere has never really struck me as a terribly strong argument for not trying to do the right thing somewhere. Now, that's my view. Others may disagree with it. How are we going to feed a growing global population? Because we have seen following the buying up of mineral rights around the world by countries that are thinking, how are we going to keep our economic engine continually fed? We're now beginning to see people buying up land, particularly in Africa. It was Mark Twain who once famously said, he said, if I were you, I'd buy land because they've stopped making it. And if it hadn't been for the contribution of science, which has enabled us to improve grain yield over the last 50 years, that's how we've broadly, in terms of global food stocks, kept ahead of Malthus, but of course the food is unevenly distributed. 1 billion people overweight and obese, and 1 billion people roughly going to bed hungry every night. So the fundamental political question, who gets what and how it's distributed, is never going to go away. But we need science to make a contribution. We need to change bits of our common agricultural policy, because if you're undermining farmers in sub-Saharan Africa by dumping your produce, if you haven't got good infrastructure, you were based in Ethiopia. I will remember my first visit going to a village, a place called Makani Salam, as I recall, and sat with the villagers, and we talked about investment in land. And there were two issues in Ethiopia at the time. One was that the government had land redistribution. And that was a big problem, because you're a farmer and you think, well, the government might come and take my land away in 10 years' time and give it to someone else. Is it worth me spending a lot of time, effort, and money on improving the land? No, not really. And DFID did some research which demonstrated this was a bit of a problem, and in came a system of land certification which allowed people to pass land on to their kids in a country with a different legal and land ownership system. But I remember discovering to my horror that a 100 kilogram bag of fertiliser in that village would cost the average family half their annual income. So why was that? In part because of the poor transport infrastructure, the cost of fertiliser, getting it there. So access to seeds and tools and mechanics and loans, and then markets for farmers in the developing world is extremely important if we're going to improve productivity, there is a tension between subsistence farming and, of course, large-scale, more mechanised farming. And other technological changes have brought benefits. The sweeping across sub-Saharan Africa of the mobile phone. When I last looked at the stats, there were 3 times as many mobile phones as there were fixed landlines in sub-Saharan Africa. I'm sure it's now 6 times, 9 times. And for farmers, it would mean they could bring up the market and find out what people were paying for maize today or whatever. If you're fishing off the east coast of Africa, am I going to put into Dar es Salaam or somewhere else? What's the fish prices? So technology is a means of helping people, as opposed to having to walk 4 hours to market to discover no one's buying today and then walk 6 hours uphill back. So those are the global pressures, and you need international cooperation. But at the same time, there is a great thirst for people to have influence over what happens in their communities. So these two things are happening at the same time, because a big problem in our country is that people have lost a bit of confidence in the political process, the economic crash of 5 years ago. I am of a generation, the first for quite a long time, where if we're honest, we would say to ourselves, we're not entirely sure that the future for our children is going to be better than the life that we have enjoyed. The environment, pensions, can they afford to live somewhere? Global conflict. Now, that is quite dangerous for society. People feel too many decisions are taken too far away from them. And you look at the rise of English identity and English nationalism, which is something that has happened in recent times, in part because of devolution of power to Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, restoration of London self-government. And more people describe themselves as English as opposed to British, and of course our identities are multi-layered. I'm a citizen of the world, I am half American, I was born in London, I am a Member of Parliament in Leeds, I support Tottenham Hotspur Football Club, but I represent Leeds United Football Club. Now that's just a list of some of my identities, but I think particularly in England there is a great desire for devolution of power. As my colleague Graham Allen said recently at the LGA conference where I was speaking yesterday, he said, you know what, England is the last unreformed outpost of the British Empire. And I think that is true, because a lot of decisions are taken centrally, in part because we create the pressures. I think back to my time in government, and I represent I'm very proud to be a Labour Member of Parliament, and we want to make progress on a lot of fronts, and you get into government and people come to you and say, what are you doing about domestic violence? What are you doing about getting kids to read better? What are you doing about improving policing? What are you doing about encouraging cycling? What are you going to do about teenage pregnancies? And we ended up with 1,200 performance indicators for local government. And in the end, I don't think that works. And what we have to decide as a society is, where do we want as a nation state to set standards nationally? And I think the length of time you wait for an operation should be the same. It's a national health service. I don't want different lengths in different places. Access to social care, the greatest social challenge that we face, growing elderly population. How are we going to look after our mums and dads, and before long, for some of us, it's going to be us. And how are our kids going to look after us when we need support? And the decisions where we need to accept, people locally decide on how many libraries they're going to have. You could have a system where you say every council shall have one library within 1.5 miles of every residential house. You could do that, but I don't think you can do that. Because in the end, communities have to decide for themselves. And the reason why I think this is so important is, one, you cannot run everything from the centre. Secondly, that feeling that power is being taken away. There is less money now, so there's a really strong incentive on all of us to take the money that we have got and use it to greatest effect. And some of the piloting that's been taking place on what are called community budgets. If you take the Troubled Families programme, this is a good example of localism to do here with Leeds. You think of some families where a lot of stuff is going on, and what interaction does the state have with them? Someone from school attendance turns up because the 15-year-old daughter isn't going to school. And then the police turn up because the 17-year-old is in trouble. people may have problems with their benefits. There might be antisocial behaviour. I'm not painting a picture of one family, but the fact is the state has all of these different interactions with that family, but comes and goes, reporting back to its own authority and different budget lines. Or take another example, health and social care. My colleague Andy Burnham has laid out a really strong vision for the future of the health and well-being of our society. And he makes a terribly simple point. We have a pot of money for when we break our leg, we have a pot of money for when we're old and need support to live at home, and we have a pot of money for when we get depressed. Now, we are the same person. I break my leg, I get depressed, I get old. Bringing that together in what he describes as whole person care, so that we're not spending money keeping someone in hospital, as we do at the moment, where they don't need to be there medically, because we haven't got the cash to pay for someone to get them up in the morning, or cook them lunch, or do their shopping, or put a handrail or a walk-in shower into the flat they live in. So this pressure and desire to try and sort things out locally, I think, is extremely important. And the final point I'm making, just in these observations, is this. Why does that matter? Because if we lose confidence in the ability of the political process, by which I mean people and those who are elected working together, politics is not about you sitting there with your arms folded and saying, right, now, so you're my MP, right, do this, do that, do the other, and then I'll go away and do something else, and then after about 10 minutes I'll say, well, I'm afraid you haven't solved the problems of the world, you're not much good, and the next. I call that consumerist politics. We have come to the end of the road for consumerist politics, because that's not how societies develop. Wherever they are in the world, it's not how we progress. I think it's about contribution. Now, it may be a bit strange, because in politics you get sometimes to feel you've got to have a policy on everything and an answer for everything, as if you're Superman or Superwoman. We're not. We are public servants representing people, but dealing with these problems is about working together. And what can I bring? What can you bring? What are you going to do? To take the very simplest example, so mundane but important, there will be no rubbish on the streets, and I get people who ring me up and say, what are you going to do about the rubbish, Mr. Benn? If the bins are provided, we put the rubbish in the bins, they get collected, and if you've got a bulky item, you ring up and the council will take it away. And if we do that, we won't have sofas in front gardens, we won't have rubbish strewn round the streets. It's a really simple example of how we can sort stuff out if everybody plays their part. If they don't, then you've got a problem. And I think that the way to restore confidence in the political process, which has an astonishing power to change things, I said to the students this morning, how much did you pay when you went to the doctor last time? And they looked at me very blankly, and eventually someone said, well, I didn't pay anything. Well, why didn't you pay anything? Well, because it's free, it's paid for taxes. That's absolutely right. Why is it free? Why is it free? Because of politics. In trying to encourage them to vote, I got a pen and a piece of paper and said millions of people did that with a pen on a piece of paper, and that's why we got a free National Health Service. And my next engagement is at the LGI to celebrate the 65th anniversary of the National Health Service. Now, if that doesn't demonstrate the power of politics, people working together to utterly transform people's lives, then I don't know what does, but we have to work hard to restore confidence. Right, that's all I wanted to say. Now, what do you want to talk about? And don't be bashful, and who's going to be first? Come on then. Questions, comments, contributions. So I hope I'm not causing difficulty for you by moving about, as far as trying to film it is concerned. Anyway. Yes?
I think there's lots of interesting things. I think the silence is because people have got so much to talk about.
Great.
On the overseas picture, I think you mentioned people buying land in Africa, and I think what the Chinese are doing in Africa is quite peculiar, and I just wondered if you had any comments about it. They seem to be buying lots of land, factories, everything, and that sort of is quite an unusual strategy.
Well, they're taking an approach to development. In part, it's about securing, as I said, a pipeline of supply for the Chinese economy. Because in China, the economy is going to grow and develop, and they're very keen to keep that going while maintaining a particular political system. But they're also investing a huge amount of money in infrastructure in Africa. You go to conference centres, and the chances are the Chinese built it. and you go to sports stadia, and the Chinese built it, and there's a new road that the Chinese have invested in. And people would, I suppose when I became the International Development Minister in the first instance, you know, I was, in the true sense of the word, pretty ignorant. I mean, I did not know. I'm not, like to think I'm not stupid, but I did not know, and I learned an enormous amount. And of course, development is about progress on a whole range of fronts. You know, peace and stability being a building block, having decent roads, having customs posts where you don't wait for 3 days for stuff to move, because that encourages people to invest in a country because they can move their goods in and out. It reduces the incidence of HIV infection, because what do lorry drivers do if they're waiting 3 days for their lorry to move? So, I mean, there's lots of different examples that you can give, and so the Chinese have taken a view that that's a particular contribution that they make. Land is, of course, very, very sensitive, because you have a decision, what are you going to do with your land? And if people find, and that's the other lesson from all of human history, if people find that they can't make a living or cannot survive where they were born and brought up, they will do what human beings have done throughout the whole of history: they will move. And you look at a country like Bangladesh, where most people live within, well, I don't know, 20 metres, less probably, of the sea level. If sea levels were to rise in the way that some scientists predict over time, and that is to be seen, then quite a lot of Bangladesh is moving house. Because it's not going to stay there to drown, they're probably going to move next door, which is to India. So that's another reminder that within developing countries, what happens in one country is going to affect, and most refugees flee to the nearest safe place. When the Taliban were running Afghanistan, about 4 million people fled the country. Most of them went to Iran and Pakistan. Some of them came to Leeds, but most of them, and then quite a few went back when the Taliban disappeared. So I think this is a particular approach that the Chinese are taking. It's different from the approach that we take to development, but good infrastructure is good for economic development. What do you think, since you asked the question?
I guess it felt like a new form of imperialism, that they'd invented a cleverer way, an alternative to the British Empire, and the Chinese Empire of the next 50 years might be owning industrial and agricultural assets all over the world.
Well, we have a lot of overseas, not so much governments, we have a lot of overseas companies owning our assets here. And it's brought jobs and economic benefit and incomes to people, and it's a reflection of the globalised world of which we are part. 150 years ago, it was British-owned British businesses, but we're now part of a global world, and we're in a global race, and both a race and a cooperation. Those are the two challenges. And the question for Britain is, okay, how are we going to earn our living in the world? It's not by entering into a race to the bottom. It's about, which is why institutions such as this are so important to our economic future. Yes?
Hi there.
Hi.
I'd like to refer back to the littering example you brought up.
Yes.
I've had the good fortune to live in deepest, darkest Hare Hills, and the signs there on the road sign, I noticed a warning: do not drop litter or you will be fined. And again, I had primary school aged kids, and that just made no sense to me whatsoever, not doing something because of some rule. Now I'm equally lucky enough to live in Chapel Allerton. The local park is our back garden. There are no railings around it. And in the whole park yesterday, we saw one Coke can, which we picked up.
Yeah.
It's just not happening down there at all. I'm also lucky enough to have been part of Occupy Leeds. And I did spend a lot of time at camp. I spent overnights and stuff. And the most amazing thing, the life-changing thing I got out of that, was even though it was meant to be political, but sort of wasn't really, because we had to look after it. Our prime concerns were feeding each other and looking after each other and making a safe space for everyone, so everyone had a voice, safe enough so everyone had a voice. So that soon became our politics, in a sense. And what was amazing, we didn't know each other. It was, I knew one other person of the 11 that put down the initial tents. And there were hundreds involved to some extent or another. Vulnerable people from all walks of life. And within our circles and our decision-making process and just the way we mix together, we all wanted us to thrive and wanted to contribute, and that naturally happened. And I suppose what I saw, or what's important here, is the politics between us, in a sense, just between us in this room, or between us and our neighbours. That's what's important to build, rather than trying to jump too high and build politics, from that place over there, when we're not even talking to each other yet. It was an amazing experience, and I'd say there was more dialogue than debate. Everyone would throw ideas in. It was quite a positive sort of reception, really. So just, again, to throw in seeds from elsewhere.
If we're going to prosper and survive, then, we need to talk to each other. And, people talk about community spirit. It's about feeling you have a sense in the place in which you live. You know your neighbours. Now, there's, British have a certain approach to things. There's nothing like a crisis for getting us to talk in the way that we wouldn't otherwise.
Drink tea.
Well, we used to live. The time I saw more of my neighbours was when the old laundry opposite caught fire one night. Along came the fire engines, half the street came out, and of course you start talking, because it's all right to talk because there's a crisis. And otherwise, if you just said good morning to people, they'd think, oh, that's a weirdo, I'm not walking this way again.
I come from Hackney.
There you are. And obviously in big cities it's slightly more difficult, because if you say good morning to everybody on your way to work, you'd be hoarse before you even got over Westminster Bridge. So that's also about scale. But that sense of community and all of the different relationships that people got, mums and dad picking their kids up from the school gates, that's how you get to know people in the area that you live, or you're involved in a swimming club or a book club or whatever it is. And that's why community and voluntary organisations are so important to confidence and development in any community, and why, as a Member of Parliament, one of the things I try and put time and effort into is supporting those organisations, because, I can't do it all, I'm not even aspiring to do it all. I'm just one person, with one voice. But supporting those organisations, because I've seen with my own eyes what a difference it makes in an area. Just a quick story. Over in New Wortley, there was a terrible problem with 3 or 4 people who were basically making everybody's lives a misery. Joyriding, it was awful. And I went to a community meeting there, and the police came along and said, well, it's really difficult, we can't do anything about it. And there was a lot of anger and aggravation and dissatisfaction with what was happening in their community. And eventually, neighbourhood policing arrived, the police took it much more seriously. 3 of the young people were ASBO'd, which I support, I have to say, because if you had people in your surgery weeping in front of you, as I did, and I felt really quite ashamed as a Member of Parliament, where have we got to as a society that somehow society is unable to protect people from coming and weeping in front of their Member of Parliament because their life is being made a misery by someone who doesn't really know how to behave properly, for whatever reason. And I went back, I remember one particular community event I went back to about 5 or 6 years later. They'd formed a neighbourhood community group, and I just sat there for an hour, and people raised issues, and they said, now, can I talk to you about that afterwards? The housing officer was there, the neighbourhood police officer was there, and I got up and said, I just can't but help contrast the meeting I remember 5 years ago and what I'm seeing here today. Now, it's the same people, it's the same institutions, but what had been created was a network of trust and confidence and communication, people doing their jobs rather than saying, I can't do anything about it, which I thought was an abrogation of responsibility, in particular at that time on behalf of the police, and all credit to them for what they've now done. And all I can tell you from my postbag and my surgeries is neighbourhood policing has made a big difference. It's not the whole answer, it's made a big difference because I have fewer complaints of people who are desperate coming to me about antisocial behaviour than I did 10 years ago. Now, I take encouragement from that because it shows that you can change things, but the community is a really important part of it. Right, who's next? Yes?
If I could shift you for a moment from localism to internationalism.
Of course.
I don't know how willing to critique the current government's priorities you might be, but the decision to pull aid from India, any thoughts on that? I mean, that's certainly a big issue right now as economic indicators go up.
Yeah.
Even though there's still a great deal of poverty, should countries like the UK pull their aid away?
It's a really important and quite a difficult question, because in terms of absolute numbers of people living in absolute poverty in India, there are a lot of people. And yet, voices say India has its own aid program, India has a space program. Shouldn't India be sorting that out as opposed to us? And I can understand why over time that would move. In the same way as when I was the International Development Secretary, we eventually departed from Russia and Ukraine and other countries because they'd reached a particular point in their development. And there's a special dynamic in India, because international aid in India is very, very small in terms of the total size of the economy, whereas the first time I went to Malawi, international aid was 60% of the income of the government, and therefore the donors were really, really, really important people, because it's about the future of your country. In India, that is not the case at all. And I think the second point I'd make is you have to sustain political support in Britain for our development programme. And in recent tough times, there are voices who say, we've got poor people here, shouldn't we be concentrating on that? And I will say of the government, although we played a really important part in changing the Conservative Party's approach, because they had cut our aid as a proportion of our national wealth between 1979 and 1997. We came in, we increased it, and we were the first government to commit to the 0.7% target and a date. And I was the International Development Secretary at the time, but it was the Prime Minister and the Chancellor who were really led on that. And to the credit of the government, the current government, they've kept to that commitment. And I'm delighted at that, because I think it's the right thing to do. We are still a very wealthy country. It is a small contribution, but it's a recognition of our responsibility to other people in other parts of the world. And the support we give educates kids and saves their lives, because we're helping children to get vaccinated so they don't die of diseases that our kids don't die of. And you know what? I think every child should have the right and the opportunity to grow up. So I hope that that sustains. You've got some newspapers that are very unhappy about it. You've got some Tory backbenchers who are furious about it. But I hope that the Prime Minister keeps to what he's been doing, because there is a consensus across the parties that this is the right thing for us to do, and I hope that it continues. Now, can I ask you what you think, since you asked the question, about India?
Well, I only wonder if it's the beginning of a trend as countries that still have a substantial amount of their population living in poverty are gradually going to see the donors go away, just on a more general scale.
Well, certainly we have, as a country, we have focused our aid more on the very poorest countries, and we have focused on the countries in conflict. The process that I started and the current government has carried on, because actually if you can't deal with the conflict, it's really hard, as I was saying, to get the development. And so there would be moments, I was International Development Secretary, but I took part in the Darfur peace negotiations. Well, I led for the British government on the Darfur peace negotiations in Abuja in 2006, because I would say, in respect of Darfur, where is the dividing line between the humanitarian and the diplomatic political? The two were absolutely intertwined. You couldn't distinguish. And we were trying to get the rebel groups to sign up to a peace agreement, and one did and two didn't. And there's been some progress, but it remains hard. And then there's all the conflict that's been blowing up between the newly independent southern Sudan and Sudan. So you can't just look at development in terms of the humanitarian or the developmental on its own. You have to look at the wider context. And we had a good mechanism during our time in government. We had these two pools. We had what we call the Africa pool, and we had the Global Conflict Prevention pool. And I and the Foreign Secretary and the Defence Secretary would sit down and decide, well, what are our priorities? So that you were trying to bring the influence, the resources, the ideas, the cooperation, the diplomacy of the UK to bear in what you thought was the most effective way. And it bit like the community budgets I was talking about earlier, you are bringing together what it is you want to do and agreeing a common approach. Now, you also need to do that on a global scale. That sometimes can be a bit harder. Yes?
You criticise the idea of consumerist politics.
Yes.
And it does seem that the state is asked to do increasingly large amounts of things. You mentioned the 1,200 performance indicators. Yeah. But you also said that in the past, things like national sovereignty and domestic violence were things that the state didn't see was their role to sort of sort out and solve. And it does seem that the state is now, the British state, if you like, is asked to sort out problems abroad and in our bedrooms. It does seem to be an extension of the role of the state. And then I'm thinking, well, what is it that you don't want the state to take responsibility for? What do you want the individual to take responsibility for? Rather than just sitting on the chair and asking the state to do something.
Do you think it's not? Do you think it's not clear what is your responsibility?
Well, one of the things I was thinking about is the idea. One of the demands on the state historically was generating economic growth.
Yep.
And it does seem to be an idea that people actually don't want the state to generate economic growth. There's that whole debate about, do we want prosperity, and would we be better off actually focusing on well-being and worrying less about our income, which is, it's almost like people are demanding for the state to do less in that area.
Generally speaking, it is not the state that generates wealth, it's the state that taxes and spends it in order to provide the collection of the rubbish, and the health service, and teachers, and universities, and what have you. It is the private sector, it's enterprise, it's entrepreneurship, and all of those things. But there are things the state can do to make the likelihood of economic growth more certain to happen as opposed to less. That's why not having a civil war is a really, really good idea, because that's a big turn-off for investors when they've got a choice about where they're going to go in the world. Now, that's an obvious point, but I think it's worth making. Look at the debate we've got at the moment about some of our national infrastructure. Now, I support high speed too. I don't know what you think of high speed too, but I think it will be good for the economy of Leeds and for the region. Now, that is a big investment in the future. I support the new generation transport, the trolleybus scheme in Leeds. Now, there are people in Leeds who say, I don't fancy this because some trees are going to be cut down, and I think it's a waste of money, and I don't think it will really make travel swifter in Leeds. My counter-argument is we aspire to be a modern city. We're trying to get people to come and invest in Leeds so people continue to have jobs. You go to lots of other big cities. I was admiring the Manchester tram yesterday as I was walking to Piccadilly Station. Go to European cities, they've got rapid transit systems. If we're going to be confident about our future, I think we should invest in the NGT. Now, you've got to work out where the stops are, and you've got to talk to people about how exactly you put the poles up and so on. But it's the state that can do that. So creating the right environment, what your corporation tax policy is, have you got the right skilled workforce, so people who are thinking of investing in Leeds, and they'll say, but will I be able to employ the scientists I need, or the engineers? Are you producing them? That is what the state has to do in the modern economy, recognising that we are now competing on a global scale. And investment comes in, and investment can go out. And we've seen that. So lots of jobs have disappeared in manufacturing. It doesn't mean that manufacturing isn't important to Leeds or to the region. It's still very important in terms of our GDP. It's just it employs a lot fewer people because of technological change and mechanisation. But there's still a lot of manufacturing in Leeds. Now, the broader question you raise about what do we want the state to do? Well, take the domestic violence issue. People said, this isn't good enough. The state does have a responsibility for it, and I think that is, of course, that's a change for the better compared to what it was like before. But it shows how social attitudes have changed, and that in turn has changed the policy of the police and of the courts. Mine was it's a slightly different point, that the state is also, it seems to me, entitled to say to people, okay, what are you going to do? If you go to the doctor and say, doctor, I'm ill, fix me, which we tend to do, and the diet you eat, the lack of exercise, whatever, has contributed to your medical condition. Okay, what responsibility do we have to try and deal with problems that are creating diabetes or whatever? If we smoke, we make ourselves ill. So there's this debate and dialogue going on between society and the state about if we're going to deal with the health challenge as we live longer and older, we have to recognise that what we do and what we put into our bodies has an impact on our health. And it can't just be, I'll do whatever I fancy and you will fix me when I'm ill. But making that change is quite tricky in some ways. You wanted to come back and then I'll come.
Yeah, it's just, I was thinking about personal responsibility.
Yes.
The examples I had in my mind were examples where individuals are doing things on the ground and sort of taking things into their own hands. So, for example, there's a lot of schemes around Leeds where people are growing food. That's one example. The other example is, shopping consumerism. Like people are choosing to buy fair trade items, etc. So you've got that sort of personal responsibility that's being taken, and those examples I was thinking, and I was just wanting you to think if those were really solutions, or people were trying to do things, but really they were powerless to do things in those areas.
Well, the fact that people are doing it shows that they're not powerless. Those are both fabulous things. Support the Leeds Credit Union, because I've got a lot of constituents who are caught up in payday lenders or loan sharks. Now, we have within our means the credit union that will loan you money if you can put some by, but it'll loan you money at reasonable rates of interest. It's not going to screw you into the ground. And we've created it. Or community switch schemes on energy. The scheme's just been run in Leeds, saying to people, and you have to overcome scepticism because people think you're from an energy company trying to diddle me. They're not. They're entirely independent. They said, give us your details, we'll go to Which, they will identify a better tariff, you switch, you save money. And I met the team last week at the Hunslet Gala, and they've interviewed one bloke who ran a business. He saved £400 a year on his energy bill. Now, that was a community initiative. And I suppose that is exactly what I'm talking about, because when people see they can do that, you don't just have to wait for Parliament to regulate the big six energy companies more effectively. You can do something now to help people. And that's why we need strong local government. That's why what the council does, working with others, is so important, because it can be a voice, it can be a broker, it can be a bringing together of partners to make stuff happen. And if you think back to what local effort did in the 19th century, it brought gas, water, electricity, hospitals, schools, libraries, the first public parks, at a time when people had less money. Now, don't tell me we're not capable, locally, of dealing with the challenges of this century by applying exactly the same kind of effort. And I suppose the message I'm trying to get across is we need some hope and encouragement, because it's quite easy for some people to say, oh God, it's all too awful, we're doomed. The fact is, it's up to us. That's what I think. Now.
Oh, I was just going to make a couple of points. One was about people's responsibilities and incentives and contributions and so on. And internationally, we see examples of utilities not working because people pay nothing for their water, for instance, and so they haven't got an incentive to save on it. And when you bring in a system where people pay at least a minimum amount, then they have an incentive to use it more sensibly. And your point about people's taking responsibility for their health, perhaps if they had to pay a little bit towards upfront visits to the doctor and so on, and penalised for missing appointments and all this kind of thing. So micro incentivisation, I suppose you might call it, to make sure that things we expect the state to do, but if people think everything's it's just free, they don't use the services in the most sensible way, perhaps. The other point I was going to ask you about is the idea of the localism. The idea, of course, it's important that people do things from the grassroots. And, it's fabulous hearing from that lady who did the Occupy stuff, and getting to know your local neighbourhood folk and the food growing and everything that's going on is fantastic indeed. But the localism, as it's now being put across, seems, for some of us anyway, a rather cynical kind of, sorry, there's no money, you've got to do this, or, sink or swim. And the same goes, for the planning system, that it's a bit kind of cynical as a localism idea.
Right, now, well,
It's
you've raised...
hodgepodge.
No, not hodgepodge. You've raised brilliant... First of all, I'm not in favour of co-payment, as it's called, for going to see the GP. I'm not in favour of that, and I wouldn't vote for it. Because I'm paying already, you're paying already, we're paying in our taxes. And I just think that the free at the point of use is such a fundamental principle of our healthcare system that I will not vote for that, and I don't support it. And as I said, I'm half American, and until some of the recent changes that President Obama made, 40 million Americans in the richest country in the world had no healthcare, proper healthcare coverage, including my cousin. When her husband lost his job, middle-class American family, they lost the full health insurance protection that they had. So, this is real, and it's our politics that, as I said earlier, gave us the National Health Service. So that is that's the first point. Now, did you have another co-payment example?
Well, I was just saying that when people don't pay for things,
well, no,
they're not incentivised to use the resource.
Well, that's interesting. We have free entry to museums.
Yeah.
I think it's fabulous.
It's fabulous, but if you just collected £1 from everybody,
well,
you could
no,
then...
I think for those, I don't want people to be put off going to the museum because they literally can't afford it. And I have constituents for whom that is the case, all right? I really do. The cost of the bus fare into the centre of the city, the cost of going anywhere to the cinema, and if you have to pay, and because you are being chased for your council tax payment increase and your bedroom tax at £14 a week, and you are on the very, very lowest incomes, this is big bananas for them. This is serious stuff. And I'm not in favour of charging people to enter the museums, and I'm really proud of the fact that we brought about free entry. So I think it's not just about money, although it is a reflection of human society that you have got a point that sometimes people value stuff more because they've paid for it than if it. But then maybe we should think about what our attitudes are. Secondly, localism. Well, I'd say of the current government, they have localised some things, they have kept control of other things. I'm not sure it's a fully thought out localism. But let's take a practical example. I visited a library about 3 months ago in the West Midlands. The council said we can't afford to run it anymore. Councils are facing cuts in their funding of 33% in real terms. 33%. If your income went down by 33%, could you carry on doing all the things you're doing and paying for at the moment? No, you couldn't, and nor can councils. The local community there said, well, we really like our library. Can we run it with a rota of volunteers? They've got 41 volunteers and the library is still running. Now, some people would say, oh, you're just passing responsibility for the austerity down the line. But that community cared so much about the library that they're running it. Now, you have to deal with things as they are, as you seek to change them into what you would like them to be. And I thought that was a really good example of people saying, well, we'll find another way of continuing to enable people from this community to use the library. On the planning system, third example, I know a subject in which you are greatly expert, we have a housing crisis. We're not building enough homes, and two conversations happen in a lot of communities. First one is, where are our kids going to afford to live? Pause. Have you signed the petition against the planning application to build homes down the road? Now, you smile. And we know that to be true. 80% of people say, yes, we need more housing. 40% are prepared to have it built near where they live. Now, it's another example of personal responsibility. It's no good saying to government, we've got a housing crisis, you sort it out, but don't build any houses near me. Because it's a system that is built to fail. And building is about finance, land, and planning consent. That's the truth. Now, how do we deal with it? I devoted half my speech to the LGA yesterday on this very subject, which may be available on good websites shortly. But I think the essential element is, why do people oppose it? Well, partly impact on property values, partly because they value green space, and we all do, partly because it's rubbish design, partly because there'll be a longer queue on the road to get to work in the morning, longer to wait for a GP appointment, which are quite rational reasons, and also because people think, even if the house gets built, I'm not sure it's going to solve my kids' housing problem because they're not going to get one. So unless we can address those, and build a better connection between the houses that are going to be built and people seeing, I can get one of those, so that when it comes to the planning committee, instead of just people turning up saying, no, 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 you have people saying, yes, 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 because you know what, that's mine. And that's why I'm a fan of neighbourhood planning. The government brought in neighbourhood planning. I think it's a good thing, because it, under the way, as you all know only too well, the NPPF works, the National Planning Policy Framework, either developers are going to decide where development goes or communities will decide. And I think communities should say, you know what, we've got a housing need in our area, we're prepared to have development here and here, but we really, really want to protect here, here and here, as opposed to developers coming and saying, the council hasn't identified enough land, I fancy building over there, council turns it down, planning inspectorate grants it on appeal. Now, there are two ways of doing it. I think the former is much, much better than the latter. Now, Margaret?
Yeah, it was just in relation to your point about Leeds Credit Union.
Yes.
Because, you know, all this stuff about longer.com, these sky-high interest rates, you know, it's awful. And I've been reading a bit about this recently, including an MBA dissertation of someone from Leeds University Business School about the credit union and operating in the areas including your constituency. And I was just thinking, oh, well, maybe one of the things that we could do is try and get a university scheme, or at least encourage our staff to join the credit union, because they can take the money at source through pay-as-you-earn, which is a really easy way of paying into it. So if we're interested in helping out people who are getting involved in longer.com, not having to need to do that, then I think, you know, if we put in 1% of our income, that's money straight into the credit union and not to longer.com. And I think that could have a massive impact on that problem within our local economy. So anyone with me, because I'd like to set it up.
Well, it sounds like a great idea. I am a member of the Leeds Credit Union, and there's one other thing we could do, and it comes back to your point about planning, is at the moment, a bank closes down, a payday lender can open up in a bank without having to apply for planning permission, because it's in the same use class, as it's called. And we are advocating, as the Labour opposition, that actually local authorities should have the right to create specific use classes for certain types of premises, because there are places where you walk down the street and it's betting shop, payday lender, betting shop, payday lender. Now, one, that's bad for diversity in the high street, because other people who might be coming to set up a shop say, crumbs, I don't really want to... I mean, and I'm not taking... people like to bet, and that's fine, but you're going to have too much of one thing. That's the point I'm trying to make, just for the avoidance of doubt. And that is an example of enabling communities that would otherwise feel, well, this happens and we can't influence it. But if you give them the power to have a use class order which says, okay, we've got enough, and we can do that with pubs and clubs. The planning system has changed. You can look at cumulative impact. And I think that's just a sensible thing to do. The government currently is moving in the opposite direction, and I worry about the effect of that. Indeed, I'm just wondering if anyone who hasn't yet contributed would like to say something, ask, comment, observe. Yes?
About the museums and access to museums, I know you addressed this anyway, but
Yeah.
It's a different business model. If you let everybody in, you tend to get more people going in, and then make it easy for them to make a contribution. So there's a donation box there where people can drop money in, and they might run an expensive cafe which reaps some profits in for the museum. And I think if you deny access to people who are on low incomes to go to educational activities like that, then it's making a mistake.
I agree with you 100%. And you find people who are in a position to contribute will do so. It's like, you're going to churches and you think, gosh, this is beautiful, and there's a little box saying it costs quite a lot to look after the church, would you like to contribute something? And some people will put money in. Yes?
Yes, there's been a lot of talk about the Millennium Development Goals and the post-Millennium
Yeah.
Development Goals, and I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit about the UK's position on the post-2015 agenda.
Well, the Prime Minister has been co-chairing the group that has been looking at this, and they, as far as I'm aware, they've come up with some quite specific, measurable, achievable goals. I think the MDGs have been really helpful. We will not clearly have achieved them all, but the point about a target is it gives you something to aim for, and you can measure the progress that you are making. And I think it's been an effective way of getting the world to try and focus on this. it's the responsibility of donors, but it's also the responsibility of countries where those goals have not yet been met to think, what are we going to do, and to progress it. It's become slightly more difficult, in truth, in recent years because of the global economic crash, because there is a tendency for countries, obviously, to focus on the problem that they've got here and now. That's why for climate change, it's been more difficult. But can it really be that we can only think about these global problems when times are good? Because actually helping to solve those is really important to our own economic future. If you think, well, I'll put it off for now and I'll get back to it later. On carbon, there's no doubt that the successful businesses, communities, countries in the future will be ones that are low carbon, ones that use resources efficiently and don't waste stuff, and conserve water and design their buildings in different ways and adapt to climate change, so that if we do have a lot of really hot summers, no sign in the last couple of years, but you never know, then you should be thinking about that for the future. Because if you don't, that's the argument, if you don't, then those countries that are, and those businesses that are going to actually have a better outcome than those who don't. So I really hope that have they finally reached agreement? Because my responsibilities are other things now. Anybody know?
No.
But I think they've had a couple of meetings and they've published some draft proposals, and they will eventually be adopted by the UN. But I think MDGs are a good thing, because we can see progress. And the other point about progress is simply this: it encourages you to do some more stuff. And there are moments when you do just have to pause and say, right, now where did we start? Look what we've done. The first African country I ever went to was Malawi. And at the time, I met the Vice President, Justin Malawezi, and he was debating, can we do anything to get antiretroviral drugs to some people in Malawi, because we've got a big HIV/AIDS problem. Now, the donor community's attitude, actually the British government's attitude at the time, was no good talking about antiretrovirals because you haven't got a functioning health service, and you should first things first. But I was profoundly influenced by my discussion with him, and came back, and we changed our approach. And when I went to Malawi for the second time, just before I ceased to be the International Development Secretary, I think from memory they had about 400,000 people on antiretrovirals in the space of 5 or 6 years. Now, was that progress? You bet it was progress, and we had helped to fund and support, as had other donors, but they'd taken the decision that we should go for this, even though we're also trying to build up our health service infrastructure, because you know what, it's about saving people's lives so they don't die. And I'm wholly in favour of progress, and I think we should have more of it. Yes?
Just going back to what you were saying about climate change and emissions and companies in this country and other kind of developed countries reducing their emissions, do you not think that the focus should be more on consumption? Because even though in the UK, for example, we're targeting emissions and coming up with ways to reduce emissions, but we're consuming more, a lot of which results in emissions in other countries like China and India. So should our focus, when we're at international meetings, not be more about reducing consumption as well as obviously reducing emissions?
Well, in industrialised, in inverted commas, developed countries, debates about consumption are quite tricky politically. So if someone come along and say, I think you should be consuming less, is that okay? Would you please start consuming less in these circumstances? There are ways in which we can do that. For example, say our consumption of water. Water meters are now compulsory for new properties. Obviously, people pay for their water bills in the UK, and the way we design houses, grey water harvesting, all of those kind of things. That's the first point. The second is the ways in which technology will come to assist. Because the point I'm making about this is this: if we come along and wag our fingers at each other and at the world and say, you know what, you've all been really, really bad, you've been very, very naughty, it isn't, in my experience, a terribly good way of encouraging people to make the changes that are required, in part to address the issue that you've raised. And what most people will say, if they get that there is a problem, and that's the first stage, in other words, we need to worry about this, will then say, okay, show me what it is I should be doing, help me, show me how. And that kind of debate is much more effective in terms of, going back to colleague at the back's question about behaviour change and personal responsibility, I think is much more effective in that way. Now you can send signals within the system, and that's what the carbon price is about, because we know we've got a problem with carbon, so putting a price on it, because it hasn't been priced up until now, is a way of trying to get people who consume a lot of carbon to adjust what it is they're doing. And that includes businesses. Because 30 years ago, the idea an investor would come to your business and say, what is your exposure to carbon? What? What do you mean? What's all that about? That's a question that investors ask now, because they are thinking the price of that will, in the long term, go up, because in a market economy, that's one of the ways in which you change behaviour and therefore patterns of consumption. So I think it's an extremely difficult question that you have asked, because what is the Earth's capacity to sustain a given level of consumption across 7 billion people, 10 billion people? Now, Malthus would have said, he said, you won't be able to do it, we'll be starving. And the fact that we're not starving, although the food is unevenly distributed, is a testament to the contribution that technology and other changes can bring. I don't think there's a solely technological solution, but we need to find them to assist us in making the transition from the society we've got now to the society we need to have in the future. I could probably take one more. Anybody who were you stretching, or you were going to ask another question?
I was going to say about
no,
Malthus.
That's fine.
Malthus was saying that your population will carry on increasing until it reaches the limit of its resources, and then it will usually crash. But our population, we're likely to go up to 10 billion, you've heard that, but then after that it's likely to go down again.
Now that is true, and this is the exquisite dilemma of development, because what is the evidence? Societies that develop, people have fewer children. You look at the graphs, it's very striking. You look at the 19th century, places like Sweden, big families. Now why do people have big families? Access to contraception, the level of education of girls. Getting girls to school leads to girls having fewer children later in life, and the kids grow up to be more healthy. Evidence is absolutely clear. And in a country with no social security, your kids are your pension, your carers, your labourers, if you're a subsistence farmer, you name it. So I suppose it comes back to your point, because development will, in the end, will make a big contribution to moderating the growth in population and the number of children that people have. How do you balance that against the demands and the needs that we've got at the moment? And there are, of course, some societies where the population is now falling because the replacement rate, people are not having enough children to replace the population. So it is different in different parts of the world. That's why I think all of us are very passionate about education, girls' education, access to contraception, because the evidence is absolutely clear that those have a contribution, and help women in particular to decide how many babies they have and when. And that is a good thing for society, and it's good for the babies too. Now, I think, sadly,
right, well, we'll say thank you very much. First, I want to say thank you to the audience for such a wide range of questions. As I said at the beginning, those of you who might have missed it, we're really pleased to have such a wide audience today at this event by the Centre for Global Development. But thank you very much to Hilary Benn and for his stimulating thoughts.